Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly discussion series that's being hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. Today, our guest is Mr. Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He is the author of several books, including Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, and Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Cause for Liberty. His books have been translated into many languages and praised in the New York Times, Wall Street Journals, and Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, among many other publications. Meanwhile, Islam Without Extremes was banned in Malaysia for challenging the authority of the religion police. Welcome, Mustafa. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation with you, Eamon. Thanks for the generous introduction to my work as well.
Well, I was first introduced to you and your work in 2013 when the Chaldean News sent me to cover an event that, where you and Mr. Richard Thomas were in a debate at Eastern Michigan University, and it was a debate about Islam. Islam is a religion of peace, and I was very impressed with the debate because I just believe intellectually using reason, freedom of speech, and tolerance, and everything that you discuss actually in your new book, Reopening Muslim Minds, which I just finished reading and really enjoyed. I really liked your honesty and the courage to be so honest, and sometimes in situations that can be, can bring danger in the situation, as in, your book not only being banned, but one of the first things that I read in the introduction is you sharing your encounter with Malaysia's religious police in 2017 that was due to a lecture you gave. So can we start off with you, sharing what the lecture was about and how it conflicted with their beliefs? And did this incident influence the writing of your new book?
Thank you, Eamon. Thanks for reminding that debate back in 2013 in Michigan. Yeah, I think it was a full event. I remember that.
It was a great event, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Good to hear that. And well, my book's introduction chapter begins with that story in Malaysia. Like in 2017, September, I went to Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, because I was invited there by the Islamic Renaissance Front, which is a reformist organization working on human rights issues from an Islamic point of view. And they organized these lectures for me, and one of them was on a very sensitive topic, which is apostasy. Arabic speakers would know it as ridda, like giving your religion and publicly renouncing your faith in Islam. And I gave this 30-minute lecture saying that, well, listen, in classical Islamic jurisprudence, this was seen as a capital offense, like a punishment with a capital crime, and a crime with a capital punishment. But I said this was the product of a certain context. It was seen as rebellion to the state. Today, it doesn't have any meaning like that. There's no basis for this in the Quran at all. The post-Quranic basis is open to discussion. And I reminded Quranic verses like La ikraha fid din, which means, there is no compulsion in religion. And I said, our religious tradition maybe sometimes didn't take this seriously enough, but let's take it seriously. So let's have no coercion in any religious matter, which would mean people should be able to freely enter Islam and exit Islam too, if it's their choice. And I said, by the way, if people don't genuinely believe in Islam, you cannot force them to become good Muslims. I mean, you can make them hypocrites. Religion is not something that you can police. That was a punchline of the talk. And I was leaving, and people applauded. Most people were happy. And then 5 serious men walked in, and they said, "Are you Mustafa Akyol?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Did you say religion cannot be policed?" I said, "Yes." And they said, good, we are the religion police. So they showed me their identity cards, and their job is literally defined as religion enforcement officer. So there's that institution in Malaysia called religion police, which is milder, much milder than Saudi version and the Taliban version, which is, you know, quite concerning, but still they monitor things, they police things. And they didn't like the fact that I advocated religious freedom with Islamic arguments by referring to the Quran. And the next day, they summoned an arrest order for me, and I was leaving the country at the airport, and I got arrested. So I was put in a cell, and they took me to a Sharia court, and I was questioned. Luckily, they let me go, and that was thanks to some diplomacy that I mentioned in the book. But this was, for me, just one example of a broader problem we Muslims need to discuss in the modern world today. And that is, there are interpretations of Islam that are at odds with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the now quite conscientious understanding of freedom. I mean, why would you force anybody to be a member of a religion? Why would you punish them for being an apostate or a heretic or a blasphemer? Those problems are there in the world of Islam. And I should stress that the people who really use these verdicts to do acts of violence like terrorism are really marginal and extremists. I mean, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they really, really don't represent the Muslim mainstream at all. They actually attack Muslim mainstreams because they find them heretics too.
Right.
But even in some mainstream teachings, we don't have terrorism, but we still have oppressive interpretations of Islam. Oppressive in the sense that a disrespect to full notion of religious freedom, and to forcing women to cover their heads and, you know, to wear a certain dress code, or to punish people for saying something they consider as blasphemous. And these issues, and that all goes back to discussions about Sharia, Islamic law, and how do we understand Sharia in the modern era. And I have the clear position that, well, Sharia is a part of the Islamic religious tradition. I'm respectful to it, but it should be like Halakha, the Jewish law today in the modern world. You know, Orthodox Jews willingly follow the Halakha, which means, you know, there are dietary laws, there are certain prayers and ways of life. Voluntarily, you can follow that. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you make it the law of the land, imposed on everybody through the power of the state, that becomes an oppressive system. And that is why I'm in favor of religious freedom of all conservative Muslims. I mean, I'm with Muslim women who want to wear hijab, and they're not allowed to do that by some French secularist, you know, law. So there are problems in that regard as well. But it should be simply the choice of Muslims to live piously or not piously in the way that they choose. And of course, Muslims should accept to be living under the same legal status with non-Muslims, equal rights for non-Muslims, which is also one of the contentious issues in Islamic law. And in my book, I get into all these issues, and I show that there are problems. Honestly, we should face these. But I show there are reformist views, even in the Islamic tradition, even in like 10 centuries ago. This scholar had this very enlightened view, but it didn't maybe become mainstream. I show late Ottoman Empire, you know, reformed some of these laws, gave equal citizenship rights to Jews and Christians, for example, which was a new thing for the Islamic civilization. So I show the problems, but I also show how Muslims can move forward on these issues by accepting to be living in free societies without religious coercion and without toleration to different ways of life, beliefs, and religions.
Yes, I did notice that you actually bring up quite a bit of history on how things were in ways that people might even not give credit to because they're just focused on what's happening today politically in the Islamic world. So for instance, on page 2, you write, after the initial centuries of Islam, which were intellectually diverse and vibrant, there happened a significant decline and marginalization of kalam among Sunnis. Islamic culture became a legal culture focusing on proper behavior rather than proper belief. Can you explain what is meant by legal culture and how some of its rules conflict with the modern standards of human rights?
Well, by legal culture, I refer to and I criticize a concept of religiosity, which is simply based on a few acts of course, faith. We believe in God and afterlife, angels and prophets. But then how do you apply your religion? Well, there are do's and don'ts. You have to do these things and you have to not do these things. So things that are haram, that are halal, and there are farz, that are obligations. And these are prayers, dietary laws, fasting in Ramadan, which I myself do some of the practices. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if a religious understanding is about do's and don'ts, you start to become too legalistic in the sense that you may lose the principle and the ethics behind it. These are the things you should not do, the 5 things that you should not do, that's good. But there are other things that's not covered by law, so you're free to do that, right? For example, quite a few Muslims will be cautious about interest. That's riba, that's in the Quran. Actually, modern banking interest and riba are 2 different things, but in my argument, but that's good. So they'll be very careful not to take any modern banking interests, but they can be fine with a financial transaction, which is actually not fair, which is not defined as interest in the Islamic tradition. So, they can be super obsessed about how a woman should be dressed, but they would be less careful about being fair to human beings and being compassionate or being forgiven. So this rigid religiosity that do's and don'ts ultimately build is a problem. And that's why I think we need to cultivate the perspective in Islam, which focused on the intentions behind religious rulings. God is banning something, but why? What's the purpose? And God might be banning something in a certain context, but in a different context, you might need to think very differently. Now, there is one example. This sounds too theoretical, but let me try to articulate or exemplify with a clear example. You may have heard that in Saudi Arabia, they haven't allowed women to drive cars for quite a few years, right? Recently, now they're actually taking a few steps there. In Afghanistan, under the Taliban, women were not allowed to walk even on the streets by themselves alone. And now the Taliban says, no, we are actually better now, and we will allow that. And that's seen as a great step. Now, there is this obsession, if you will, in this legal culture I'm describing about, that women should not go around by themselves without a male guardian, mahram, that's the term. Now, where does this come from? Well, it comes from a commandment, an injunction by Prophet Muhammad, right? Peace be upon him. We read in Sahih al-Bukhari, that's the hadith source that is most authentic, considered as most authoritative. You read Prophet Muhammad saying, women should not go alone without a mahram on a trip that is more than 3 days, or trip of 1 day. So it's right there, it's written. So classical scholars look at this and they said, yeah, this is the commandment of the Prophet, we should do this. And how long is a trip of 1 day or 3 days? There are different calculations. This is all 7th century standards, like by camel. So, 55 miles or 87 miles. Now, these are still in jurisprudential books, fiqh books. And today, if you go to a conservative imam in UK and ask, as a Muslim woman, can I go between London and Birmingham? They will check the distance. No, it's more than 87 miles. So you cannot go by yourself. You have to have a male guardian. Now, this is the blind literalist approach to religious texts that I'm criticizing. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to look into 7th century Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad may have really said this, but you should understand that there's a good reason for that sort of caution in 7th century Arabia, and that is between Mecca and Medina, between the big cities in the desert, there were bandits that would attack any unprotected woman. A woman would not be protected by anything other than men, because it was a time of swords and spears, and women didn't use those things. So a male guardian was something to protect women from a clear and present danger in a society where you didn't have an orderly fashion and police forces and travel and so on and so forth. So the Prophet's intention was the safety of women, like so. And if you care about the safety of women traveling today, I would say you should, probably remind them fasten their seatbelts, while driving. That would be a better way to serve that intention. So this is one example of how we can look at injunctions in Islamic law and understand the intentions behind that. And those intentions are moral. I mean, those intentions had a good point in all cases, I think, in the Quranic case. And some of the things attributed to Prophet Muhammad himself is disputed whether he really said this or not. But with this perspective, we can have an understanding of Islamic law that is more ethical instead of blindly literalist. And we will obey because we're told to do so without thinking the rationale behind it. So I'm calling for, in Reopening Muslim Minds, a more rational interpretation of the Sharia and Islamic law. And that goes back to understanding what the law originally meant in its original context.
So what is the fear of having this kind of discussion? Because right now I am learning so much from what you're saying, and I'm even understanding what the Prophet did say, and the details and how it, at that time it was this way, and then now it's kind of different. And I even heard that about the hijab and the veil, that it was used for protection, and where like right now it could be bringing the opposite effect, where it's like kind of bringing danger to certain women for them wearing it. So what is the fear behind having this kind of a discussion? I don't even feel like in this context it's even like a debate, really. It's just a discussion. What is behind that people fear that you're changing anything from what was?
Well, the fear is that you will be introducing human rationality into the understanding of religious texts. And human reason is corrupted by hawa or temptation. So you will be just doing things that are good for you, beneficial for you, that you benefit from, that you desire, but you're actually giving up piety. And I'll tell you, there might be that problem. I mean, some people might be twisting religious rulings, saying, oh, this means like this. I mean, if somebody says, charity in the 7th century Arabia, that a zakat meant this, today it means you should all donate to my own personal foundation or something. Obviously, that will be a corruption and that would be a twisting. But what the rigid conservatives don't see that. Rigid conservatism can also serve hawa, that is desire. I mean, there are men today, 60-year-old men marrying a 12-year-old girl, in buying her from parents. And I mean, that is grossly immoral and cruel and unacceptable. But that is justified in a certain jurisprudential understanding, right?
Yes, that's right. And that does take place. And then so like, for instance, even if in Iraq, if legally the girl has to be 18, but if a tribal cleric allows for a 12-year-old, and then the process becomes complicated because if the tribal leaders okay it, then the legality of the government doesn't count.
Exactly. Or for example, I mean, dictators in the Arab world can be praised by some people saying, oh, there's a hadith which says, obey the ruler no matter what he does. So we are following this hadith. And of course, that dictator is very happy with that interpretation. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that traditionalist, strict, literalist understandings of Islam can also be, and are very often, are actually used to serve temptation, desire, exploitation, immoral, unethical ends. So I think the criticism that if you try to change things, if you try to reinterpret things, it will always lead to unethical ends is wrong. Quite the contrary. What I'm saying is that, of course, we should be careful of not twisting a great religious tradition simply because we want that, but we should have a sense of ethics, right? God cannot commend something that is unethical. That should be the beginning point, right? And our sense of ethics as human beings means something. It can tell us something about what God also is intending. But can you make this argument or not? That opens up some theological questions in Islam. Do our ethical understanding mean anything in the sight of God? Well, some theologians said yes, and these are the ones that I highlighted in my book. But there were other there were alternative theological schools in Islam which said, well, God does whatever he does and you're not supposed to question. You have to obey without asking the justification. And God can do whatever he wills, and there's nothing that bounds the will of God. So these are different understandings of God and theology as well. That's why my book goes between jurisprudence and theology quite often while discussing these issues in Islam.
Well, and that brings us to, you said, you're right in there that, well, it's said in general that Islam is said to believe in universalism. And one of the scholars hosted at the House of Wisdom, which is in Baghdad, if you can just tell us a little bit about that, about the House of Wisdom, was Al-Kindi. He wrote, "We ought not to be ashamed of appreciating the truth of acquiring it wherever it comes from, even if it comes from races distant and nations different than us." So what has changed over the decades that led to the rejection of the universal?
Thanks for reminding Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi is known as the first Arab philosopher, and he was the pioneer of philosophy, the philosophical tradition called falasifa in Arabic, in the Islamic civilization. And we owe Al-Kindi, of course, to Baghdad and the translation movement that began in Baghdad before him. And that is when Muslims who came from the Hijaz, the Arabian desert, mainly to conquer it and build an empire stretching from Spain to Iran in about a century, Muslims came across with these pre-existing cultures, including Chaldeans, I'm sure, and other Christians and Greeks and Jews and Hindus. So especially in Iraq, which was a quite cosmopolitan part, maybe the most cosmopolitan part of the world at the time, Muslims came across with these traditions. And luckily, they didn't say, let's destroy all of this. They could have done that, Mongols did that. But Muslims said, okay, let's engage with this, right? And so you see the rise of Islamic philosophy and theology and rational jurisprudence in Iraq. It's not an accident. In the 7th century and then late 7th century and then 8th century. And one of the highlights of that engagement was engagement with Greek philosophy. Muslims began to read Aristotle and Plato, thanks to Christians actually, because they couldn't read, but they hired Christians to be the translators of these books from Greek into Arabic. So all the Greek literature was translated into Arabic, which was a massive endeavor and a great event in world history. And especially this was done in different circles, but in House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad. This was the world's greatest think tank at the time, if you will. And Al-Kindi was employed in a House of Wisdom. And he said that, we should not be ashamed of learning from different cultures and races, whomever they are from, because God gave human beings not just religion and revelation, but also an inherent reason and conscience. And people who are not Muslims can still use their reason and conscience and wisdom to understand things and build wisdom. So with that universalistic understanding, Muslims studied Aristotle, Plato, tried to reconcile those Greek philosophers with Islam, this way, that way. But this led to a reaction as well. There came a movement which said, oh, no, philosophy leads people to heresy and infidelity. So philosophy is kufr, that is infidelity, that's just outside of Islam. And Imam Ghazali is much disputed here. He was nuanced. He renounced philosophy on the one hand, some of their excesses, but he tried to incorporate a little bit. But ultimately, in Sunni Islam, what the view that dominated is that philosophy is dangerous, and if not heretical, right? We don't need that. What we need is our religious texts, our religious tradition. And if you bind yourself only with your religious texts, which are explaining the world in a certain context, you inevitably lose the universalistic wisdom.
And in any religion, anybody who just limits themselves to that, that's what ends up happening. And what I also like, really like this book, what I enjoyed is that while you are addressing so many issues, but you're also bringing very beautiful things to surface, including like some of the people that I had heard of and read about, but others I had not. For instance, Ibn Rushd, so his views on free speech was interesting. And I'd like you to just kind of talk a little bit about him and also the influence he left, particularly on the Jewish community.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for carefully reading my book and highlighting all interesting
Yeah,
parts.
I really did enjoy it. I mean, and the figures that I found in it, I feel like they're so inspiring. We get all boggled down, having come from Baghdad, we get boggled down by the negativity. But I always try to find these other aspects that we tend to neglect. And what I like about this book, you don't neglect that. So there is this balance, which I think really what life is about, this balance of finding the gems of what we can inspire to think about, and then also finding the things that are maybe harmful for us to reconsider. So that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed this book.
Thank you so much, Mim. And just before getting into Ibn Rushd, which I would love to, just say that, you are coming from Baghdad. I know the Chaldean community has seen horrors in the name of Islam through ISIS. And so as a Muslim, I'm ashamed by those things. And I think that this is insane. And, of course, they don't represent Islam, but they do represent some extreme strain, which still refers to some Islamic texts. And we should be honest about that. My belief is that the Islamic civilization is at its worst era. In the past 14 centuries, this is the biggest crisis that we have seen. And this much violence, this much fanaticism, and especially with the widening gap between the rest of the world and Islam. And civilizations sometimes go through bad eras, right? Bad periods. Christianity was pretty bad in the early 17th century when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in the middle of Europe, right? 30-year war. Heretics were burned at the stake, in late medieval Europe. So there was a time that Christians couldn't get their act together, honestly. Especially, actually Eastern Christians were doing much better, but European ones were really pretty impressive. But and to give credit to our traditional Christian friends from let's say the Middle East, but at some point, a Christian named John Locke came out and wrote a letter concerning toleration, and he said, you know what, this doesn't exist in the Bible. Jesus didn't tell us to establish theocracies, and there are no divine rights of kings. There are just rights of human beings. He said men, but expanded to all human beings later. So the ideas of toleration, religious freedom flourished in early modern Europe, the Enlightenment, thanks to the horrible things done in the name of Christianity, as a response to the horrible things done in the name of Christianity. So today, I believe we are at a low point, the lowest point probably in the Islamic civilization, but precisely because of that, there is search for a way forward, right? And that's why I'm bringing these discussions in Islam. So it's just a broader point about the mission of the book. Let's come to Ibn Rushd. Now, Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, he was one of and I think in my view, he was the height of the philosophers and the philosophical tradition, in the Islamic civilization. It began with Al-Kindi, then you have Al-Farabi, then Ibn Sina, you have a few others, and then Ibn Rushd he was of course in Cordoba in Spain, which was the gem of the Islamic civilization in the let's say 12th century. And he's known in world history. He's quite famous actually in Europe. That's why he has a Latinized name like Averroes. People knew it. There were Averroists in 13th century France. Why? Because he commented on the whole Aristotelian corpus and wrote these massive commentaries on Aristotle. And Europeans learned Aristotle from Averroes. So the Greek philosophy was lost in Western Europe. It came back to Europe thanks to Muslims. And Averroes is the key figure there. That's why for centuries, Christians referred to Aristotle as the philosopher and Averroes as the commentator. So he was the man who brought Aristotle back to them. So that's why he's famous in world history. But what is little known is, and that's known. Check Wikipedia, you will see Averroes, Ibn Rushd, his view, how he introduced Aristotle, and he was a great scholar of Aristotle and all that. He was also a qadi. He was also an Islamic judge, and he has books about Islamic jurisprudence, the interpretation of the Sharia as well. So he was an Islamic scholar too. And as a philosopher, he also introduced some ideas about how to reinterpret Islamic law. So he was an Islamic reformist, if you will, too, which is very little known because it was hinted in his, books on Aristotle. And in the book, I highlight those things, which I owe to some scholars who recently actually discovered these writings. For example, he criticizes the oppression of women in Islamic society.
Yeah, that's another thing that I was going to ask you about his
Yeah.
views on women.
Yeah, he has remarkably progressive, if you will, feminist views on women. He criticizes Muslim societies for not appreciating that the women have the same intellect with men. So always putting down them only child rearing and childbearing and housework, and never appreciating their intellectual wisdom. And he says that's why these states are. This is the reason of the poverty of these states, which is very relevant to Afghanistan, for example, today, if Taliban goes in the same direction. And also he speaks of something called the unwritten laws of humanity, Sunan al-Gair Maktuba. He says there are laws of societies, and Sharia is one of them, or or canon law, or Jewish law. I mean, people have these legal traditions. But he says there are unwritten laws of humanity, like compassion, like family, love for family. And he says those unwritten laws are actually above the written laws. So if there's a conflict between those two, we should interpret the written law. So he says, like, if there is a conflict between universal values and the Sharia, we should reinterpret the Sharia, which was a remarkable thing to say for an Islamic scholar at that time. So, and what is interesting and tragic is his books on philosophy put him in danger. There were strict conservatives in Cordoba who were suspicious of Aristotle and philosophy and all that. And in one of his writings, he quoted a Greek philosopher who worshipped Venus, the planet Venus. And this was depicted as he himself worshipped Venus, like he is a pagan, right? Which is kind of, when you sometimes today put something, people put it on Twitter and show that this guy is one of those or something, whereas it's out of context. So he was canceled with an out of context, quotation. And then he was arrested. He was publicly humiliated, and some of his philosophical works were burned in Cordoba. They were they burned the books. And some other books survived. So we have a lot of books, especially his Bidayat al-Mujtahid, which is his jurisprudential work, that survived in Islamic civilization because that was not a problem. But his philosophical works became a problem. What is tragic and interesting is that those works, we have them now. We still have those works. How do we have them if the Arabic versions are lost? Well, we have them in Hebrew because those works were translated into Hebrew as well. And Jews preserved those works and learned from them. And in the 13th and 14th centuries, there's a whole movement called Jewish Averroism. Like Ibn Rushd became very influential among the Jewish community. And I refer to Lord Rabbi Sachs, who passed away a year ago. He was a great public intellectual from the UK, former chief rabbi of Britain. And Rabbi Sachs wrote in one of his books that Ibn Rushd's approach to free debate influenced the idea of free speech in the European tradition. Because Ibn Rushd has a saying, which we see in the Hebrew text. He says, if you're going to present an argument, always give a fair share of quotation to your opponent. Otherwise, you show your own weakness. Like instead of silencing somebody, let them say what they say. And if you don't do that, it will show weakness on your side. So be proud of your argument and have an open check. Now, this was taken by Rabbi Yudah Lev, who was a great Jewish scholar and a philosopher, and he expands this. As Averroes said, this is a great idea. We should not silence the enemies of religion. We should actually have an honest, open discussion with them, and so on and so forth. And I quote them all in my book. And according to Rabbi Sachs, this was the beginning of the idea of free speech, which was, of course, advanced by Milton and John Stuart Mill, and led to modern day liberalism and the idea of free speech we have today. So what I'm trying to say is that some of the values we see in Western liberal democracies today, like free speech, freedom of religion, let's say market economy, these things had actually some Islamic pioneers. And Ibn Rushd is one of them. Ibn Khaldun is one of them when it comes to the economy. And in the book, I try to show these things to, first of all, to tell fellow Muslims like that Western liberal democracy, when you see that, don't reject it. I mean, it might even have some ideas that we ourselves had. And also it's a lesson for, I think, people in the West to not to think that they invented everything by themselves, right?
Oh, of course.
There's great contribution from all other civilizations to West and vice versa.
And also, I mean, these teachings, I think what I appreciated as you were quoting him in your book is that right now, this whole silencing of others is not serving anybody. I mean, on a very basic humanitarian element, the opportunity to discuss freedom of speech takes away other forms of us. I guess it's not fighting, it's debating, but then I think if you don't have that opportunity for a healthy dialogue and discussion, and even if there's going to be debates and arguments within it, it prevents from violence, wars. I think a lot of countries end up going in that direction because communication is an art. I mean, I witnessed that when you were having the debate here in Michigan, and I thought it was artfully done from both sides. I was watching you guys going back and forth, and it was like myself as somebody who appreciates this information and not being biased and they're just really enjoying learning. I learned quite a bit just from that time. And the same experience happened now, and it's just because being just truthful and having and feeling the freedom to express yourself is a very powerful, peaceful tool, you know. And that is why when I was reading these, if we were to highlight these figures a little bit more, but there's no room. There's so many people creating so much conflict and looking at matters that are not really at the heart of what the religion is really about, that we don't have the opportunity to raise these individuals to the height that they deserve. Another person is, which I know about this person through a documentary that I watched, not knowing what the documentary was about, but the name attracted me, Muhammad Abdus Salam. He was, which is also, he is mentioned in your book, he was the first Muslim to win a Nobel Prize in science. And unfortunately, he was shunned by his own country of Pakistan. So because of what you wrote about the sciences and such in your book, you know, how does that attitude that his country, his birth country had toward science contradict with the Islam of ancient times?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for reminding us. That's a sad story. I mean, Abdus Salam was the world's first Muslim Nobel Prize winner, laureate. He was from Pakistan. But the moment I say the sentence, I can imagine some people from Pakistan coming in. No, he was not a Muslim. He was a heretic, right? Because he was an Ahmadi. And Ahmadis are a community in Pakistan, which are Muslims. I mean, as they stated, they have the right to define themselves. They believe in a 19th century Messiah, which, I mean, I certainly don't have beliefs like that, but they believe in that. And they accept the whole Islamic tradition, Prophet Muhammad, the Quran. And they say, and in the 19th century, Mirza Ahmed Ghulam, this reformer, came and he was a Messiah or some kind of a prophet or some figure like a Mahdi. And that's very unusual, a very unorthodox belief, but whatever, that's what they believe, and they have all the right to do so. And now, in the founding of Pakistan, Ahmadis were considered as equal citizens, right? And no problem, and they defined themselves as Muslims, so there was no legal problem with that. But in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, there became this Islamist resurgence in Pakistan, which brought in Islamized laws, which led to horrible violence against women and persecution and terrible things. And also the condemnation of Ahmadis. Oh, they're not Muslim, they're heretics. They cannot call themselves Muslims. If they call themselves Muslims, that itself becomes a crime, right? Yeah, so the government bans them from stating themselves as Muslims. The Constitution defines them as heretics and not Muslims. So it's very bizarre. And because of that, I mean, they've suffered a lot of violence. They've suffered incredible discrimination. And Abdus Salam was an Ahmadi. And he was proud of Pakistan, but Pakistan disowned him. I mean, some of the things, awards were given to him were pulled back. I mean, there's a great documentary about it on Netflix. I mean, I recommend seeing that. And
I really recommend that. That's what I learned about. And that was very sad because, like, we all, the way I felt like his love for his birth country is how we all feel, like even myself, even though I left Iraq as a child, but there's this feeling inside that you're always connected to that land somehow, and his love for that. So yeah, go ahead and share what happened after he passed away. With,
He, I mean, that documentary will show you all the details, but he was basically, he passed away sadly because his country pulled, I mean, he was awarded certain things that was pulled back. Even his burial site was not allowed, you know, in the Muslim cemetery. And the fact that he was disowned by his country, and the fact that the first Nobel laureate in the world has been condemned as a heretic by a lot of people in his own country, shows that, you know, sectarianism is a poison, not harming non-Muslims, but us first primarily. I mean, if you disown your own people because, you know, they believe in something additional than what you believe, and if you can't live peacefully with them, that, I mean, Christians, again, had the same trouble. Christians, actually, Christian troubles were worse. I mean, the sectarian persecution in the history of Christendom in Europe is actually quite horrible. I mean, we have been actually better than that in history. But now we are seeing these things in now Afghanistan. Taliban is in power again, and the Shiites are afraid about their future. Taliban is giving some guarantees, that's fine, but they don't know what's going to happen to them. In Malaysia, in all places, being a Shiite Muslim is not, you know, welcome. I mean, the Shiite ceremonies have been raided by police. It's seen as officially defined as a heretical sect. If you're a Shiite in Saudi Arabia, you will be discriminated against. And if you're a Sunni in Iran, you will be also discriminated against. Recently, I said in a podcast that there's one country in the world where all different sects of Islam live in peace and harmony and no persecution at all. And that is the United States of America. And I'm sure Canada is doing pretty well. UK is doing well as well, because these are countries with secular constitutions with liberal values and of religious freedom. So you can be an Ahmadi or a Shia or Sunni or Salafi in the United States and live happily and without being persecuted or persecuting anybody. Mm-hmm. And I think we should get an idea from that, right? I mean, we don't need Islamic states. We need states that will respect human rights.
Yeah, I mean, getting ideas from elsewhere, this is just, I mean, for me, like, there's things from my ancestors that are very dear and I think have helped me in so many ways. And there's new, you know, concepts and there's new opportunities here in the Western culture, and it's combining those two. And, you know, when you were saying about Muslims, how they were affected, they're very affected, because even what happened with ISIS, even though what I mentioned to you happened with the Chaldeans and the Assyrians and other minorities, but the Muslims were extremely hurt as well. You know, millions of people were affected by this, and they're innocent people that had nothing to do with any of it. And, you know, you brought up in the book the Islamicity Indices, which is published every year by a team of US-based Muslim academics. And they write about their findings in comparisons to the safety and the security and all the things of certain beliefs compared to the other parts of the world. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I found it interesting that the countries that were used, which were compared to, and US doesn't kind of fall on top of that. But I mean, if you can share that, and I'll add my opinion about that.
Sure. This is an index which measures which country in the world is most Islamic. It's called Islamicity Index, but they measure it in a different way that, you know, that from what quite different from what you can imagine in the first place. The first time you hear it. And let me try to explain it with this. I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that there's a perspective in Islam that looks into the intention behind religious commandments, right? There are commandments here, and there's the intention. In Arabic, it's called maqasid, intentions or higher goals of the Sharia. Now, classical scholars like Imam Shatibi define these or listed these maqasid or intentions of Sharia as the protection of 5 values: the protection of religion, life, property, lineage, and the intellect. Like, for example, God bans alcohol. Why? Oh, he wants to protect our intellect. God bans adultery. Why? Because he wants to protect lineage, whose father is his son who. So God wants theft because property should be protected. So, and other scholars expanded this gradually in the 20th century. Ibn Ashur, Tunisian scholar, added hurriya, or freedom, to these intentions of the Sharia. So now there is this kind of literature which says, there is a Sharia, there are Islamic laws, but there are the higher objectives that these values are searching for. The goals are, right? I mean, the scholars who built this Islamicity index did a smart thing. They said, okay, let's look at these intentions and list them, like things like safety, healthcare, justice, rule of law, lack of corruption. And they said, okay, these are the Islamic values, right? Okay, let's list the countries, let's measure the countries based on these Islamic values and which countries are the most Islamic from this perspective. And guess what? Which countries are the best? Generally, it's New Zealand, the ones at the top, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Canada, Ireland. The top 10, are certainly either Australia, New Zealand, or
I don't even think I don't know that the US was on the list, but I know
it's not doing too bad, but on some issues, healthcare is not great, and there are a few things maybe dragging US down, but US is doing pretty well too. The funny thing is, in the first 40 countries, there is not a single Muslim majority country, right? So Islamic Republic of Iran or the Islamic Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, they're all pretty low in the list. So the fact that they are officially Islamic and they have waved the flag and they have these labels doesn't mean that they really serve the values that must be the very higher objectives of the Islamic law. So that's a whole new way of looking into the world. And I think as a Muslim, if I want to live in an Islamic country, I think I'm living in one US now that I'm pretty happy with it. New Zealand doesn't look bad. Islamic in the sense that countries whose values are admirable from a genuinely Islamic point of view. They're not officially Islamic, obviously, and they shouldn't be.
And what I noticed is that list, so the position of women, the lives of women in those countries, they have like so much freedom in their positions. And I think that the way they contribute, because it's just like you said, economically or in any situation, women are able to help men in so many ways. And then when there's more of that equality, I think that you have a better community and a better culture. And I noticed that the list that they were mentioning, it seemed like the positions for women, which even the United States and we have observed, just have more equality for them, it seems like.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Women's rights is one of the bleeding wounds, I think, in the Muslim world today. Again, the Muslim world is a complicated place and not everywhere is the same. If you go to Bosnia Herzegovina, which is the most freest Muslim majority country, or even in Central Asia, you don't have any laws that discriminate against women, and the social attitudes are generally quite fair. But in the Arab world, there are problems, and especially in Saudi Arabia, there are huge ones. So even in the Arab world, Lebanon is not the same with certainly Saudi Arabia. But one problem is classical interpretations of the Sharia, the jurisprudence, certainly gives women less rights than men on a set of issues, like on marriage, divorce, inheritance, travel, the rights to move around, and the idea that women should be at home, that's her place. I don't look down upon the value of motherhood and the most important importance of motherhood for children and the family. It's really important, and I'm not agreeing with some of the modern reforms or feminist perspectives which look down upon them. But it's women's choice. Some women will choose to mother, some people, or they will be mothers and have a career and all that, and that's wonderful. And that's how a society thrives and a family thrives. So these legal injunctions and also social teachings. And again, there's hawa behind it. There are some really unconscientious, unacceptable jurisprudential texts in some Islamic sources. A woman should always satisfy the sexual needs of the husband. Otherwise, the angels will condemn that woman and that sort of stuff. Like, I can't make myself believe that this is the really teachings of a religion. I think it's like patriarchal scholars who wanted obedient women, I think somehow invented these things, or society invented, and ultimately the hearsay became a part of the religion. I believe religious traditions, especially in Islam, in this case, carries a lot of cultural baggage. 1,000 years ago, people had attitudes about women, which was not egalitarian anywhere. Christian society was also quite oppressive in Christian Europe. But when those cultural attitudes become a part of the religious tradition, they just live on, for decades and centuries. And that's
for me,
to distinguish.
I think like the part La ilaha illallah, that just, if we were just to focus, one time this a Jewish woman I was talking to, and she said, if we could just focus on the 10 commandments, and if we could just, and not get all caught up with all these like other details, and then, if we could, La ilaha illallah, I mean, if you could just think, that does put a universality that you kind of just surrender, and the Islam, the word surrender, you're just surrendering to a higher power and not defining all these. And it's unfortunate that we get so boggled down by all these other information that's coming in, and then you really lose track of what matters. That's what's happening, is that the spiritual part of what I grew up to feel Islam was, because we grew up in Baghdad. I mean, our whole community was Muslim, and we didn't even talk about these things. We didn't even, as children, differentiate or anything like that. And it was kind of when we came here, but the spirit of the people that surrounded us was about spiritual sense of that oneness that kind of got so, removed by all these other technicalities. And but people like yourself and many others that I'm working with, that I'm actually inspired by, because I think that what I've noticed is, even like with the women, I recently worked with a group of women that are Muslim, and they're a lot more outspoken than me, and I admire that, and I'm inspired by that. So there's so many people that are trying to do what you're doing today. But what advice, this is our last question, is what steps can one take to this reopening of the mind in general, I guess, but because this is your field, what would you advise somebody? What role can they play?
Well, check my book, maybe the said.
Yes, I agree. Yes, because it addresses a lot of things that goes through our minds that we cannot find on, mainstream media and things like that. But this digs into it. And by the way, it's one time somebody said that, great writing is simplicity, courage, clarity, and this book has all of those. So it's very easy to read, and there's like a suspense element to it as well, even though it's not.
Great to hear that. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, I try to bring these discussions into public light with knowledge, with understanding, but also with simplicity as well, because you have to elucidate arguments, and that's what I try to do. Well, I mean, the discussion is going on in the Muslim community for sure, all around the world. Like, how do we understand Islam? What are these troubling interpretations? Why do we have them? And there's a spectrum of views here. There are really hardliners who will say, this is written here, and kill the apostates, and we'll do it, and no doubt. And that's like, they take pride in that fanaticism. And then there are more thoughtful conservatives who see that there are some problems and try to take some steps. And there are others like liberal reformists, and I would put myself maybe towards that camp, who are saying, hey, listen, this is a really crisis, and we have to think these issues thoroughly. And one thing is that La ilaha illallah, you pointed out, God, and there's no God but God, and nothing is greater than God. Like we respect our religious tradition, but our tradition isn't divine, right? I mean, great scholars we respect, from Imam al-Ghazali to Shafi and all others who built the Sunni tradition or the Shia tradition. We respect them, but they lived in a dramatically different time from us. They had very different concerns. Their culture is incredibly different. Maybe if they lived today, they would be taking quite reformist steps compared to some of the views that they had back then. So the divinization of tradition, I mean, Fazlur Rahman says, who's one of the great scholars of modernist thinking, reformist thinking in Islam, maybe the biggest one actually in the 20th century, was the great Fazlur Rahman, who passed in 1988. He was from Pakistan, who had to flee Pakistan and come to US to teach at the University of Chicago. He said, because of a also a complex with the West, because on the one hand, there are a lot of good things in the Western societies, Western values. We like them. We see them. They work. I mean, liberal democracy, market economy, and all that works. But on the other hand, the West has been an imperial colonial power that has come to Muslim societies, and that built a unfortunate, vicious cycle. Like you admire certain things, but they are the people who colonize your country, so you're angry at them for this. But how do you then accept the other thing? So, but he says, because of that, we just created a defensive attitude that we will change nothing. We will question nothing. But the people we say we will not question anything, if they were us, if they were in the same place today, probably they would question things. I think it needs, Muslims should understand that. I mean, Islam is really not a religion with a clergy, in the sense that there is no one big imam who knows everything and will tell us. I certainly don't claim any authority like that at all. But what I'm saying is that every Muslim should think for his or herself. And ultimately, we are Muslims because we are responsible to God, not any earthly community or any person. And we should try to make up our minds. We should build more conscience into our religious understanding. And we should not fear from saying that this is unconscientious and a just God wouldn't say this. So I don't buy that, right? I mean, I don't think that this text can mean that, or I don't maybe even believe that this text is authentic in the first place. I think we should begin to have that kind of conscientious objection to some of the things that are thought to us as the requirements of our religion.
Mustafa, thank you so much for having the courage to speak your truth and to do it so eloquently and easily understood for everybody. And I really appreciate this. We will have a link for your book, Reopening Muslim Minds. I really suggest and recommend that people read it. It's an easy but very informative read. We'll include a link, and I look forward to your next book as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Inshallah, as we say.
Okay,
inshallah. Visit Michigan again, inshallah.
Oh yes, and please contact us, and we'll give you a tour of the Chaldean Museum. Thank you
so much. Thanks to you and your community and everybody who's listening to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.